Hello and welcome to the IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we are hosting an episode that provides an opportunity to present a research journal together with its editor. The aim is not only to introduce the journal, but also to offer a critical assessment of suitable venues for publishing research articles. Problems of Post-Communism is a long-standing peer-reviewed academic journal that examines political, economic, security and international developments in post-communist societies. First established in 1952 under the title Problems of Communism, the journal was originally published by the United States Information Agency and adopted its current name in 1992 to reflect the profound transformations following the end of the Cold War. The current editor-in-chief is Dmitry Gorenburg, a political scientist and senior researcher at CNA, who oversees the journal's editorial direction and its engagement with contemporary debates on politics and international relations of post-communist countries. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Gorenburg is also a Harvard Davis Center Associate and previously served as Executive Director of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies, which is now the Association for Slavic East European and Eurasian Studies. His scholarship focuses on Russian military reform, Russian foreign policy, and security dynamics in the former Soviet Union. He also runs a blog, Russian Military Reform, which I will include in the YouTube description. Let's start with the first question. As we said, Problems of Post-Communism traces its origin to Problems of Communism, and that was founded during the Cold War in 1952. How has the journal's mission evolved since the collapse of communist regimes, and what elements of its intellectual identity have remained constant?
Well, so first of all, it's really kind of been two separate journals. The part through 1991 was under the U.S. government, and then when the Cold War ended, the U.S. government, USIA, basically shut down the journal, and then it was revived in 1992 by a group of academics led by Jim Millar, because they felt that it was too valuable a resource to just disappear. And then since then, it's been privately held, first published by M.E. Sharp, and then since 2015 by Taylor and Francis. So it really kind of, in terms of the evolution, it really is very different to be, a U.S. government publication versus a private academic publication. So in that sense, I think the first, almost 40 years were much, and I know less about that era because I wasn't, even in academia at that point. But it was more policy oriented and less concerned about academic types of issues. And even then probably until I became editor, it was very much focused less on publishing really academic articles and more specifically on having academics write very policy accessible kinds of pieces. So whether that was on specific issues, which was I think most of it, but sometimes also on things going on in the field, so a range. And when I became editor in 2011, I sort of thought there was a gap in terms of the academic coverage, and I think we'll probably get to the substance of this later on, but I wanted to have a space for policy accessible but academic articles, is I guess the short way of putting it. So that's kind of the direction I took it, more just standard academic articles of a particular kind, but nonetheless academic articles, rather than some of these like more policy-oriented pieces that, and kind of news of the field and that sort of thing. There was plenty of that as well of the academic type articles earlier, but it wasn't the exclusive thing. So that's, I think, been kind of the big picture, let's say, of evolution of the journal.
Within the broader fields of comparative politics and international relations, how would you define the journal's distinctive intellectual niche? What's your research DNA, and what sort of articles you are trying to attract?
We try to be interdisciplinary and we try to be accessible. That's sort of the guiding kind of principles. Beyond that, it's very broad and covering the post-communist world broadly conceived. I mean, it's mostly social science. It's mostly political science, sociology, anthropology, but we get history articles to some extent, and really in terms of we're very broad in terms of the topic. We've published on international relations. We published on energy issues. We published on memory politics, domestic political developments in various countries. So from that perspective, there's no particular focus in terms of topic. It's really just try to avoid too much academic jargon, I guess, make it so that, let's say, whether it's in the US government or Europe or somewhere else, can read and understand what.
When journal publishes a sort of wide range of topics, it's always interesting how the journal is keeping that intellectual coherence across such a diverse thematic scope. So how is it in your case?
I think the region is the key, right? And there have been debates in the field, especially, I mean, they kind of keep coming back, but the most recent was after the Russian invasion of Ukraine about, is this still a coherent region? Is there any point in studying all of these, very disparate parts of the world from, a number of countries that are now EU members and, part of Western Europe, really, to, Central Asia, China, but there is this legacy, and I think that's the key, and because that legacy shapes developments, and so I think that's the common thread that binds. I mean, binds is maybe too strong, but connects the various research agendas, articles that we end up publishing, because it does shape what happens, and then you can have articles on, let's say, patronage systems, right? You can have there are certain aspects of the way communist polities were set up that mean that you could have some basis for comparison between patronage systems in, let's say, China and Hungary, or in the Balkans, or even more Central Asia, or wherever, right? So that is, I think, and that's just one example, but those kinds of things, the way memory politics are used in much of the post-communist, certainly the post-Soviet world. So things like that, I think are kind of the way it coheres.
For some scholars, it might be also interesting how much of communism should be in the article, because from the name you have the problems of post-communism. So let's explain this. Like, if I have a paper and it's related to, let's say, Yugoslavia or Ukraine, Uzbekistan, those countries, do I need to work with the communists, like higher theory, Marxism, and things around? Or it is more territorial?
It's territorial. It's definitely territorial. People are welcome to submit, Marxist-oriented, theoretically Marxist-oriented articles, or to focus more directly on issues of communism. And of course, some of the countries that are in our remit are still officially communist, China being, the most prominent example, but also Vietnam, Cuba. We've had a couple of articles on Cuba over the years, but really it's that legacy aspect. There's no need to focus on anything specifically communist or Marxist related.
When we speak about the themes, we should also mention comparative politics, international relations, and area studies. In terms of ratio, how the journal is directing, do you have any sort of ratio, like I want 30% of this, 40% of that, 50% of that, or it depends on individual articles that you like and the editorial board also agrees on?
Yeah, there's no particular disciplinary divide that way. We're kind of, I mean, this is kind of even a general point. We follow what gets submitted, right? We don't really focus on, okay, we need some of these and these kinds of articles, or some of this region or that discipline or anything like that.
Looking at submissions over the past decade, or let's say 15, 10 years, what major intellectual trends have you observed in the study of post-communist politics?
So I think there's been a growth in focus on places other than Russia. The war has shaped that to some extent more recently, but I think it's broader than that. It long preceded that, where there was more. I think if we go back to the 90s, let's say, there was still this perception that it was Russia and its satellites, right? And now it's really much more about, I'm doing research on the Baltic states or on Central Asia or whatever it is. And that's fine. And I don't need to mention Russia at all if it's not relevant. So that, I think, is the main development. Recently, if we go to the more recent period, like the war really has shaped the kinds of articles that have been submitted, both in terms of content, like the topics that are chosen, but also in terms of the methodologies. And I think we can get into that a little bit more detail a little bit later, but just in terms of access to Russia, let's say, or even Ukraine, because of, in a very different way, but the war makes, limits that accessibility. And so there are different kinds of methodologies that have come to the forefront. And there's lots of material in recent years about disinformation. Memory politics is a big growth area that I don't think was around at all 15 years ago. I'm sure it was around to some extent, but just not as something that was, okay, now there's just lots of articles on this. And there was a point, maybe, I don't remember exactly when, let's say about 5 years ago, where we had at the same time 2 separate special issue proposals on memory politics that were different in certain ways, but just that the main theme was the same. And so I think that kind of that's something that became much more prominent. And then on the accessibility side, especially with Russia becoming very difficult for researchers to access safely in terms of doing field work, you see a lot of textual analysis as a result. We're just going to look at speeches. We're going to look at Telegram. We're going to look at, articles and things, because that's like something that's manageable. And I understand that, but it does kind of limit the kinds of findings that you can generate. So that's been a more recent trend last 4 years.
I'm going to ask similar questions from different perspective, and that's
Okay.
We have those recent developments such as democratic backsliding, the rise of illiberal governments, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How those change the kinds of research questions that scholars are bringing to the journal?
I think it's important for scholars now to figure out how to do good empirical work on Russia, given these constraints that I was just discussing. And it might be worthwhile for scholars of Russia to get advice from people who, let's say, studied Central Asia in the 90s or 2000s, who are dealing, or authoritarian states elsewhere in the world, right? There's plenty of authoritarian states that place a lot of restrictions on the kind of research that one can do there. And so I think that there's and people have uh, worked, to figure out what you can do and how to do it and how to do it safely. Um, and so that I think is that experience from other places that I think worthwhile for uh, researchers who were used to doing things a certain way, but now have defaulted to textual analysis, and maybe it's time to do something other than textual analysis and get and look for ideas in other parts of the world to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, I think the restrictions are very important because I interviewed Philip Snow, and he told me about his experience, how he went to archives in Russia during the Cold War, and it's, I think, completely different method of how to get information, because you could do it, but today not much. I think that's very difficult, and it's also unfortunate because we are restricting the science in some way.
Yeah, yeah. And there was uh it's a bit of a pendulum, right? I mean, in the Soviet times, you could access the archives, yes, but it was highly regulated. You had to have your topic pre-approved, right? And then the documents that were given to you were also screened or limited, right? So you weren't necessarily getting the full story, and you had to take that into account. And then there were kind of the the golden the golden years, right, in the 90s and through the mid 2000s at least, where most archives were accessible and you could get whatever you wanted, and there was this kind of norm that developed of the archivists being actually wanting to help you and suggest providing uh, documents you might not know about, right, and that sort of thing. Um, and during that, fortunately for research during that time, a large subset of historical documents at least were digitized and made available through various the Hoover Institution, Cold War Studies Project, various uh, venues that host that material now. So that's still accessible for more useful for historians, obviously, than for political scientists. But that's does the bulk of the archival work anyway. But now we have this much more restrictive situation. So as far as the current, if you need to get certain kind of data, it wouldn't necessarily be possible.
And do you see any interest or increased interest from Russian scholars living abroad, those who basically escaped? So they want to submit to the journal, like they want to present the ideas because they are outside of Russia, so they can afford to publish things that if they were in Russia, they couldn't.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of that cohort submitting for sure. And there's including some special issues that were organized by some scholar at risk kind of initiatives. There are also not many, but there are also some scholars who are still in Russia submitting. They have to be careful. You sometimes get conflicts between reviewers and authors about terminology, right? Because reviewers are going to, if somebody calls something uses the term special military operation, reviewers are going to not be happy about that, and then the author has to explain, well, I have to because otherwise I will. Right? So there is that, and there's sort of there's could develop some workarounds and things like that. But there is, I don't think it's a complete firewall between researchers in Russia and the rest of the world. It's, a partial firewall and maybe getting worse, but it's, for the because I'm not sure the people who are still engaging are kind of that generation who were networked with Western scholars, right, in the last 20 some years. And for whatever reason, personal circumstances or whatever, they chose to or weren't able to leave Russia, so they're still there in their universities or academic institutes. But they have those connections and they want to keep publishing in the West, and so they do that. I suspect that the younger generations coming after them, their students, let's say, are not, because they're not going to have opportunities to develop those links. So they're, unless things change, they're probably not going to be as inclined to Western journals. They won't know where to go. They won't have the connections. There won't be career incentives for them the way there were with the Bologna process and all of those things that are now suspended for the older generation.
Are there any particular topics or areas that you would like to see more submissions on, something that you are looking for?
Yeah, I'm pretty ecumenical in terms of like what kinds of, like I let the scholars drive the direction, because they're the ones who sort of are looking at interesting, what's interesting in the field, and I don't presume to. One of the sort of peculiarities of my position is I'm not at a university. I'm at a think tank, so I don't necessarily. I'm not personally engaged in doing that kind of academic research. I'm more doing policy-oriented kinds of work. So I don't presume to tell other people, what they should be working on. I let that come. And there's, if we were in a situation where there was a shortage of submissions, maybe I'd start thinking about, okay, how can we shape this so we can get more? But we have the opposite problem, so it's not something that I spend too much time worrying about.
Is it a sort of public information that you can say how many submissions you receive per month, just to imagine how intense is your work?
So I think we've gotten, in general, somewhere between 140 and 160 submissions per year, most years. This year we're on track to get a lot more. I sort of worry that this is the beginning of the wave of like AI generated articles, because that is something I've seen a little bit of. And so we'll see if how that develops. Yeah, so that's, let's say 12 per month then, I guess, something like that, on average. And then we publish 40 to 50 articles a year.
And do you want to keep this rate, or do you have any sort of internal or external pressure to publish more articles, or how is it?
We expanded a bit recently, so at the moment, no. Like we used to publish, I think it was interesting. I mean, this is kind of the evolution of the journal publishing field, as it went from print to digital primarily, right? I mean, we still have a print issue, but most people read the digital and don't even read the issue, right? They look for the article, they do a search for whatever articles interest them. So we used to have a page budget, right? The publisher would say, this is how many pages we are going to publish for your journal this year. And then you can kind of calculate the number of articles based on that, and your page links and all that. And then just like, I remember 2 or 3 years ago, it went to the opposite, whereas like you need to publish a minimum of, I think for our journal, it's 7 articles per issue. It was, rather than a ceiling, now there was a floor, right? So we can publish more, and we did for a couple of years. Because of that, the previous constraint, we had a backlog that was a bit too long. And so for the first couple of years after that changed, I published more. I published often 9 or 10 articles per issue, just to get that backlog down to, I mean, our ideal is from acceptance to publication in an issue, and I'll explain in a second why that I'm using particularly that terminology. Ideal would be like 8 to 12 months. That gives us enough of a backlog that we're confident that we have things to publish, but doesn't, make the author wait too long. So that's kind of where we're at now. The good news is with digital publishing is that you don't have to wait those 8 to 12 months to see your article published and cited, right? It goes online. And so anyone can read it, anyone can cite it, and that happens within, so it's there's acceptance, and then there's copy editing and all that. But once the final version has been copy edited and approved by the author and by me, 6 weeks or so, 4 to 6 weeks, and then it's on the website and accessible to anyone who's interested. Articles should have some lasting value because you want something that makes a lasting contribution to knowledge. And so it should still be worthwhile for readers.
Many journals emphasize methodological pluralism. And we already touched the fieldwork, textual analysis, but I want to ask you, how do you approach that balance between qualitative case studies, quantitative analysis, or mixed method research? Because some scholars might be thinking, what would be the best way, like what they are focusing on as a journal?
The trend in the field, in political science certainly, maybe less so in other social sciences, has been very quantitative, as I'm sure you know. And I've been trying to resist that. So if you have just like a purely, I'm sure you've seen like the cookie cutter quantitative article where there's some question, there's like 3 or 4 hypotheses, someone does a regression of some kind, there's a little bit of discussion, and then, some conclusion, and that's the article. I don't really find those articles that useful, to be honest. And there are plenty of other venues, to publish those. So we try to be a congenial home for qualitative research. We're not allergic to equations or data analysis or whatever, but it's best as in combination with some demonstration of actual empirical, empirical in the old school definition, right? Of like you've been to the country, you've talked to some people, you've sort of read something, right? You have some knowledge of the place rather than just having plugged in some data into a spreadsheet and press run on your software. So if you have those things in combination, that's great. But if it's just like a purely quantitative article, there's other venues that I would think would be a better home for that kind of article. So that's sort of my kind of mentality when I look at a submission. Is like, if it's just very kind of math oriented or very like data driven, I have published those kinds of things from time to time if the topic is particularly interesting. But my initial thought is that my readers are probably going to be less comfortable with this. And so you as the author will have a better experience in terms of readership, right? If you publish this somewhere else. So that's sort of my philosophy, I guess, on that question.
From an editor's perspective, what are the most common problems you encounter in manuscript submissions? Are there particular mistakes that early career researchers frequently make?
I'll start with a couple of old problems and then one new problem. So one thing that's I think often gets people is just it's very basic, but anonymizing the manuscript properly. Just because you need to, in order to have a fair and unbiased peer review process, you need to not reveal who you are. there's a tendency, I think it's decreased over time, but there has been a tendency, especially among scholars from the region, to kind of cite everything they've ever published uh, on anything related, right? And then it becomes very clear who the author is if they have, like 7 citations to like their own publications, some of which in like fairly obscure places maybe that nobody else would find. So those kinds of things. But we have processes that, there's a editorial assistant on the publisher side that like reviews each manuscript and makes sure that it's properly anonymized. What tends to happen is that there'll end up being, this is kind of something I'm not necessarily cognizant of unless it comes to my attention, is there's a back and forth between the assistant and the author where they keep rejecting the manuscript from submission, and they have telling them fix this, fix that, right, until it passes those checks, and then and then it comes to me. So that's just something that could speed up the process if you do it right the first time. It's not a big deal, but just something to keep to be aware of. And then the other thing that I think is worth just knowing, and this is something I've in the past uh, kind of taught workshops on with a colleague on for scholars from the region on how to get published in Western academic journals, because there is like there's certain kind of processes, I guess, that you might not be familiar with if you haven't been exposed to. And so the other thing is just responding to reviewers in a like you'll get right, you submit the manuscript, you get some reviewers, they provide comments, and then the unless assuming that it's like revise and resubmit, the manuscript will then be sent back, ideally to those same reviewers, or at least some of those same reviewers, to see how you've addressed the changes. And so it's helpful for the reviewers to have a little report, like just like 1 or 2 pages saying, this is what I did, this is how I addressed this comment, this is how I addressed that comment. And that's something that, and you know, ideally in a non-hostile manner, right? It's like, so that's something that I think most people are doing now, but when I started doing this 10, 15 years ago, people it wasn't quite as much of a norm. So that was something that I was always teaching, is like, okay, now you've got this, here are the comments. Like, here's an example. Here's somebody did this, right? Like, here's a little extra document that you can now submit. And then it's easy you made the reviewer's job easier because they don't remember what they read, 6 months ago or 3 months ago or whenever you first submitted it. But now you've reminded them of what their issues were, and you've told them how you address it, and they can compare that, what you've said in a little document, to the manuscript, and it just makes everything run smoother. So those are kind of the old problems. The new problem is AI. And uh, there's, and I think this is something that's quite new. So over the last years, we've started seeing like submissions with kind of noticeable levels of AI use. And so I think best practices and guidelines on that are still evolving in the field, and I mean in academia as a whole. There's bad ways to use AI and good ways to use AI. I personally, and I think this is something where there's maybe tension and people have different views. If you're not a native speaker of English and you use AI to improve the grammar and the flow of your manuscript, I have no problem with this. I think some people probably do have a problem with it, so it just depends on uh, but from my perspective, if they're your ideas and you've written them, and now it's like an automated, like we used to say, could you have this proofread by a native speaker, right? Like that was a common thing that editors say. Well, now you have a machine that does that. Okay, that's fine with me. Um, Now, if you've used the AI to, um, you know, write your text for you, that's a different story. And I have had cases where a fairly recent case, maybe, for a bit of color, I'll give you an example. I had a submitted manuscript on a topic I didn't know that much about. So I need to find reviewers for a manuscript. And if I know something about the topic, I probably know the people who are experts in that subject. I can figure out, okay, I'm going to send this manuscript to so and so and so and so. But if I don't, I'm like, I'll look at the citations. I'll look at the references in that manuscript and then I look up those people and see if that doesn't make sense to send this to that person. So I started doing that, and the first person I typed in didn't seem to exist, right? so so I was like, oh, okay, this is an issue. And then so I started checking a couple more citations, and there were some people whose names I knew. So I'm like, oh, okay, well, this person exists. And this journal that they seem to have published an article that is cited exists. But if you go to that issue of that journal, there is no article by that title in that issue or anywhere else, right? So somebody clearly used AI so badly that they didn't bother to they generated some references or whatever, and they didn't even bother to check them, right? So that's the kind of thing. I mean, that's easy to notice. There are also um, like uh, there are ways to tell. It's not foolproof, but there are ways to tell if something was written by AI. It depends. I think it's getting harder because the AIs are getting better. But there are certain and so to my mind, I think where we as a field need to, or academia as a whole need to go on this is just to require clear statements of what, if you use AI, let's have an acknowledgement of that it was used, how it was used, where it was used, et cetera. Because I've in my work I've on occasion used AI for certain kinds of tasks, whether it's like analyzing patterns. It's really good at analyzing patterns in data, right? And you used to use other kinds of software, and maybe you needed to know how to program to do that. I don't know how to program, so having Claude, say here's a data set, analyze it, certain kinds of patterns. I get a report back. I can look at it and say, look at compare it to the data and say, okay, this makes sense. And then that sort of, now we've generated some findings. I can write those up, right? So that's, to me, that's great. Like that's like and then you say, this is how I used it. Right. Here's a data set. I use this data set. I generated these kinds of. I mean, and I think over time we'll get to protocols where it's like, okay, you should do like maybe not, probably not in the article, but maybe in some like depository or some online thing, say these are the queries I use. This is like something to help with reproducibility, but that kind of thing, right? Or uh, the other like area where I think AI is very useful and quite harmless is generating citations in proper format. So, for example, if I'm writing something, a lot of times I don't want to break my flow. I'll just put in like the name of the source or the link, copy paste the link, right? And then you finished, because if it's the kind of work I do is a lot of like newspaper articles, so it's not super amenable to like Zotero or EndNote or anything, things that where it's more like easier for like references of like academic articles and that sort of thing. So then I take all these links and I can put them into the AI and say, and here's the format for my publication. Generate, fully formatted references from these links in that format. It's worth checking to make sure it did it correctly, but it saves a lot of time if you do that. So that's, AI is a curse, but it's also a benefit, and you just have to use it properly and ethically, I guess is the way I would say.
Peer review process is often criticized for being slow and inconsistent. What practices does the journal use to ensure fairness and efficiency in the review process? We already mentioned some, but let's get a full picture on it.
I think is the bane of journal editors' existence right now is that efficiency has become very hard. There's many reviewers who not that they, I mean, plenty of reviewers decline, but many reviewers don't even respond to requests anymore, which is worse because that means you now have to wait to see, maybe they didn't respond today, but they'll respond in a week, right? So it adds time, time in terms of from the perspective of the author who's submitted and wants to get a response relatively quickly. If the editor is waiting 2 weeks to see if somebody will or won't respond request for a review, and then they don't, and so that just drags everything out. So that I think is really like the editors I taught. I mean, it's certainly a problem for our journal, but I think it's a widespread problem from what I understand from other editors, and that has really made it difficult to even think about fairness, because a lot of times it's desperate to find someone to review this thing, right? And so that kind of overwhelms and in combination with that increase of submissions that we discussed before, right? Now you can see the problem for an editor who maybe doesn't have a lot of support staff and is like trying to sort this out. So that's an issue that I think is, I mean, I don't know I'm not sure there's an answer. I don't know what the answer is, if there is one. But it does, I think it's going to come to a head, I think, in the next few years, where the combination of increased submissions made easier by AI and therefore, more and more reviewers get more and more requests. I can see why they're declining. Sure. Yeah, there's this kind of vicious cycle, and I don't know where it ends up or how, but this is something that I think is being discussed. I imagine that by the time it's solved, I will no longer be a journal editor, but that is certainly an issue.
Is there any practice that you implemented and the quality of the journal and the consistency have improved? Something maybe worth of mentioning as an inspiration for other journals?
The main thing that's changed recently has been kind of more support from the publisher in terms of automated systems that so if there are issues, there's like more like editorial assistant kind of things. It's not that's more on the manuscript handling side, right? But that's I don't think we've changed much else. We're a fairly kind of low staffing operation, right? Like in terms of the review on the editorial side, there's basically me and 2 associate editors. And we'd split coverage geographically. So I do everything that's like former Soviet Union. And then my colleague Cheryl Stroshine does Central Europe and the Balkans. And Martin Dimitrov does East Asia and, other, like the occasional Cuba article or whatever, other kind of random things that come along.
What does editorial board mean for the journal, and how do you get its members? Who can be a member?
So it's mostly prominent scholars in the field. I'll admit I probably haven't done as much with getting the editorial board involved as I should. It's just a question of time and like, what you have time to organize and focus on. I mostly ask them to do like more reviews than other people. Like I have my general policy is not to ask anyone more than once a year. And usually it's a lot less than that, but that's sort of my, like, if I get a list of potential reviewers for some manuscript and I see, oh, they've done one in the last year, I won't ask them. But that doesn't apply to editorial board members. I can ask them more often. And the uh, on occasion, they've like encouraged them to propose special issues and that sort of thing to kind of shape the content a little bit more that way. Uh, but it really, if I had more time to do all the different things, I would get them more involved in shaping direction, but it just, hasn't really worked out that way.
I'd like to ask you about scholars coming from Central and Eastern Europe, from sort of regions in post-Soviet space, where they might not have the same academic conditions as scholars in the Western countries. What sort of challenges do they face, and what sort of help they can receive from the journal?
I mean, the language, some we've already discussed, right? Like I think the language is in some ways maybe the biggest challenge, because if you're a grad and what you may not have access to easy, or until AI came along, easy ways to like get your language up to a point where uh, it's not an issue, so that, and then just kind of that whole. I think again, these are things that were issues more 10, 15 years ago that I think are becoming less of an issue over time as the networks kind of encompass uh, these countries more, and the younger generations of scholars are much more likely to have studied uh, in Western universities and come back, for example, or their advisors maybe did that even, right? So there's more of a knowledge of how to uh, work the Western academic system, right? Whereas the older generation, maybe they didn't really understand. Like if you were a senior professor at a university in the former Soviet Union or in some country in the former Soviet Union, the whole notion of anonymous peer review was a bit foreign. If you go back like 15 years, right? Um, and the idea that some random person who you don't even know is going to be critiquing your work, right? There was a disconnect there that I think is largely gone now. But that was something that when I was doing these workshops in the mid 2010s, mostly, that was something we were kind of working on. It's like, okay, this is part of the norm. This is not like uh, nobody's insulting you here. It's just like the process, and so that kind of support, and I think these workshops were very helpful. I mean, you only got a very tiny sliver of the potential population, right? But they kind of were like, I mean, they helped me to kind of develop my thinking on, what's how these, what the gaps are and how to fill them. But it also, I think, helped at least some researchers do that. I think it's less of an issue now, somewhat of an issue. Uh, uh, I think, one challenge that's maybe come about as a result of uh, Westernization attempts on some countries is that there are now these, certain countries have like metrics for, or you should publish in, X number of articles in uh, that certain journals that are, part of Web of Science or whatever, or archived in certain, so have a certain quality score or whatever the metrics may be. And so that leads, in some cases, that leads to kind of almost like, I mean, it's almost spam, right? Like you're getting manuscript submissions that really, I mean, that aren't up to standard, but maybe aren't even like, I don't know why they chose to submit it to this journal. It has nothing to, it's about like some, earth science or something. I don't know what, like they're just like sending things out. I don't know why. Uh, but you get that. I noticed like I could kind of, without following changes in rules in different countries, I was like, there was some years ago where I was like, oh, Kazakhstan must have implemented some like metric system, because suddenly I'm like swamped with submissions from Kazakhstan, some of which are fine, but many of which are not fine. Right. And so this kind of, I'm not sure what, the policy recommendation is, but maybe, there is some way to make this less about just not a numbers game and more about something with a little bit more. Uh, I'm not sure that that's something that's not really the editor's job I observe, right, and I can mention it, and then but it's up to like the academic communities in those countries and the policy makers in those countries to sort that out.
I also met with those standards, and there is like certain impact factor they want. There is a certain indexing they want, and sometimes I think this is constrained because you want to associate your work with sort of DNA of certain journals because you see your peers publishing there. So I think sometimes people are following more technical information than about who is publishing there and what sort of work is there. I think that might be sort of dangerous for some scholars because they might lose identity and they will be basically guided by impact factor. And many times this is not the best practice. I know impact factor is important because we can't ignore this, but still we should also follow peers that we want to associate with. I think that would be my opinion on that.
Absolutely. I agree completely.
How do you see the scholars from Africa, Asia, or Latin America regarding post-communist studies? Do you see any increased interest coming from those countries?
Depends. China, we certainly get a lot of submissions from China, but we publish on China. There've been there are a lot of scholars from Turkey that submit, publish in a journal. Have not seen much of anything from Latin America or Africa, to be honest. Like maybe an occasional submission, but very rare. So Asia, yes, but the others, not so much.
Do you encourage authors to name potential reviewers? Because I know some journals they want that information, but some they don't. So how is your journal position on that?
Absolutely not. Do not. We don't. I mean, if you send them, that's fine. I'll ignore them. But no, we don't. We don't do that. The only thing we do of that type is if you are the organizer of a special issue proposal, right? I will often ask them to provide me a general list of reviewers for, though not for specific articles, but for the issue as a whole, as a pool, right? Because that just helps me. If I have to find, two reviewers each for 8 articles on very closely related topics, that may, strain my my knowledge of work on that in that area, and especially trying to keep them separate and that sort of thing. So that's helpful. But in terms of specific articles, I think that to my mind, having an author suggest reviewers, it's kind of inviting a possibility of conflict of interest. So I'd just rather not go there.
In your experience, what qualities tend to distinguish manuscripts that ultimately become successful articles in your journal. But now I'm thinking about the form. For instance, certain journals, they want abstract to be formatted in certain way. Some journals, they want longer introduction. Some they want shorter. Some they are fussy about methodology section to be there. Some they don't. So maybe there is something distinguished that you consider as important to mention. So also your work is easier because scholars will know.
Yeah, I think maybe not those kinds of things specifically in terms of like the kind, but I do have like things I look for. So uh pose a clear puzzle, like you know, and then develop and describe a method that answers that puzzle empirically, right? So the puzzle is based ideally, I mean, it can be empirical puzzle, but often it's theoretically based, right? Like here's something that we're trying to show or disprove or whatever, and then the empirical basis for the argument that explains that puzzle, right? Because there are too many articles, or excuse me, um, there are too many submitted manuscripts, let's say, that are purely descriptive, right? It's like, oh, I noticed this thing, and let me tell you about it. Yeah, I mean, that's not going to be interesting to most readers, and it's not going to be of lasting value. So, uh, engage with, if you're engaging with existing scholarship on some issue and providing some innovation, that's what's gonna lead to success in terms of acceptance and that sort of thing. Because so there's a descriptive that the you know just purely empirically descriptive uh, manuscript that's probably not going to work. But then there's the other side, which is manuscripts that spend way too much time in theoretical discussion without really getting to the evidence or shortchanging the evidence, right? Like there should be. This maybe gets a little bit to the balance in the different sections. It's like there should be some balance where the theory is there, but is driving the explanation and the argument rather than overwhelming the reader with just like discussion of theory. And like a lot of times, especially if something's coming out of, let's say, a dissertation or something like that, there'll be like way too much lit review. Like my take, and this is kind of something I apply to books as well. That I that you want the theory should be there, but the only theory or the only literature that should be mentioned is the literature that is actually relevant to your argument, right? Not like the whole genesis of your field or your subfield or how you got here. Right? Like because nobody other than like maybe somebody's dissertation committee is interested in the evolution of thinking in whatever it is that you're studying. Uh, I mean, I'm sure some people are, but there are separate journals that deal with those kinds of historiography questions or whatever. You know, so the theory section needs to be there and focused and concise in order to provide enough information and knowledge, but then leave enough space for the empirical findings that can explain your argument, and then the conclusion that sort of brings it back to how this improves or evolves the theory. Or
The last question for today's interview. We want to mention some strategic priorities that you have for the development of the journal, some direction that you try to hit to direct the journal, and maybe something for the future, what you are preparing. Maybe there is a special issue on the horizon.
yeah, so I think I'll bring it back to something we discussed earlier on, which is in terms of priorities, which is I think this question of how you deal with the changing environment in the region, right? Increase in authoritarianism, difficulties with access. I think this is sort of where the field needs to like figure it out, so that there is, so you know, to get away from just like textual analysis of, you know, debates and, you know, Putin speeches or something, right? like that. There's a place for that, but there's probably more of that than we need to. It's easy to do compared to other things, but that doesn't, you know, it's like that old adage where, you know, if you have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right? So that's the kind of thing that I think there are ways to get at, you know, getting information in these authoritarian environments. I'm not sure what they are, but I think there are, you know, that's for scholars to figure out. But that's kind of what I would like to see more of, is like innovative ways of getting at some of these issues. Because I think there is a tendency to kind of either like for some scholars to kind of do what they've been doing, even if it doesn't make sense anymore. Like, I'm not sure how much there was I think it's gone now, but there was a long period where people were doing kind of analysis of voting in the Russian State Duma, for example, or, you know, legislative outcomes, long past the time when it no longer made any sense to do that, given the nature of the political system and how it had changed from, like, say, from the 90s to the Putin era. Right. But people were kind of doing that. That's the work they did. So they kept doing it. Right. And so there are issues like that I think there. So, and then, but sometimes, and then the other side is the sharp break where people who had to leave Russia and were no longer had access to their sources and the way they were used to, and so they turned to textual analysis. So those are the kinds of things that I'd, you know, just innovative thinking about how to, you know, methodology, and maybe again looking at examples from other parts of the world might be helpful, and for ideas on how to address, you know, those kinds of issues in the future. In terms of what we have coming up, there was a conference on 10 years of Euromaidan. That's you know, the authors or the participants are putting together a special issue, so that'll be coming up. There's a special issue on disinformation that may happen. I'm looking through my list here. Environmental governance in the post-communist region is one that's coming up. There was a workshop on what different actors in Russia, how they might act in, like, if Putin were to leave power one way or another. So kind of different, you know, what the intel, what, you know, what the security services might do, what the military might do, what different, you know, governors or, you know, different actors like that. So that's something that we'll probably see in the next year or so.
I think Problems of Post-Communism is a very interesting journal with a rich history. And I think we can browse all those issues online, which brings all those topics worldwide close to scholars, and they can work with information in the journal. So, Dr. Gorenburg, many thanks for sharing your insights about the journal, about the strategy, about those details, about the peer review process. And I think it's quite significant for scholars, especially junior scholars, who want to publish in good journals with a good reputation. Again, many thanks for being on the Area Thinker.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great. A lot of fun.